Welcome everybody to the Electric Education Center session 12, which is the 2020 National Electrical Code changes session. There's many changes in the 2020 NEC that are going to affect your life and what you do on the job. For every building other than 1 and 2 family dwelling units. All right, let's start with section 110.22a. It's a new section that requires the installer to label every disconnect as to what it controls, as well as marking the disconnect to tell it where its source of power is. So this is for all commercial buildings, institutional buildings, office buildings, etc. Anything other than 1 and 2 family dwellings. So for example, this disconnect switch might control boxing machine number 12 AVW, and it's fed from MDP number 11 PVW, for example, like that. So you have to tell what it controls and where it gets its power from. And this isn't really asking much of the installer, the maintenance electrician, the plant electrician, and all of us that are installed in the trade, involved in the trade. This is really not asking much of the installer, the maintenance electrician, the plant electrician, and all of us involved in the trade, especially the electrical inspectors. The AHJ should make sure that this labeling is done in the first place and that every existing disconnect be labeled also. The label has to be able to withstand the environment. So that means, first of all, no handwriting. Nobody can understand an electrician's handwriting. We're like doctors. You can't use pencil or pen, and probably no P-touch labels either. You're supposed to match the equipment labeling. So if the equipment comes shipped to you with phenolic labels that are engraved, the black plastic with the white engraving, for example, or the other way around, that's what you should match up. Okay, don't be using any flimsy masking tape or anything like that. Section 210.8, GFCI measuring requirement. Okay, they're telling us how to measure to see if a receptacle is within 6 feet of the top inside edge of a sink. So what you're going to do is take a 6-foot string and measure from the top inside edge of that sink. And wherever it could reach, if there's a receptacle in that territory, that will have to be GFCI protected. So that means now that receptacle under the kitchen sink is back to being required to have GFCI protection. In the 2017 code, the code said you didn't have to measure through doors or doorways. And somebody took that too literally and said, well, that means we shouldn't have to measure through the doors of the cabinet on the front of the kitchen sink. And that's not what was meant. And that's not the way it should be. So that receptacle under the kitchen sink is back in as being required to have GFCI protection if it's within 6 feet of the top inside edge of the kitchen sink. So Rich, how do I measure this 6 feet? Well, like I said, just take a 6-foot string and measure from anywhere inside that top edge of the sink, front, back, side, anywhere. And if the 6-foot string reaches a receptacle location, then that receptacle must be GFCI protected. Okay, so let's get this straight now. In 210.8a, the list is up to 11 locations where GFCI is required in all dwelling units. That means your house, an apartment building, senior citizen housing, those are all dwelling units. The amperage limitation of 15 to 20 amps was taken away. By that, I mean it was increased. Also, the voltage limitation of 125 volts was taken away. And by that, I mean it was increased. So now it's all amperages up to a limit of 50 amps, for example. I'll get to that in a second. It's all amperages and both 125 and 250 volt for all receptacles in those 11 locations. Keep that straight. 210.8a. Rich, let's say a 50 amp electric range receptacle is within 6 feet of the top inside edge of the kitchen sink. Does that have to be GFCI protected? Yes, that's item number 6 of that list. How about a 240 volt dryer receptacle in a second floor hall closet that's not even near a sink? Yes, that has to be GFCI protected. That is item number 10 of that list. So there are definitely other locations to be determined, and you're going to have to ask your AHJ, your electrical inspector, and get things squared away. Now, they don't make a 50 amp GFCI receptacle. They don't make a 30 amp GFCI receptacle. You've got to provide that protection with a 2-pole GFCI breaker. All right, 210.8A5 for basements. I wanted to put this code change proposal in, but somebody beat me to it in the last cycle. All the receptacles in an unfinished basement have to be GFCI protected right now. All right, that's in the 14, 17, and continues on. But what happens when you finish off a basement and make it a habitable room? Well, it used to be that the GFCI protection was not needed at that point, but that was wrong. A basement is a basement. No matter what you do to finish it off, throwing down some rugs, throwing up some 2x4s and some sheetrock, a basement is a basement. It has tendencies to be damp and or wet. So now, finished or unfinished, the basement will require GFCI protection for all receptacles, 125 through 250 volts, and the amperages that are listed. 210.8B, that section is for other than dwelling units. And now this includes any indoor wet or damp locations, garages, laundry areas, accessory buildings, service bays. Now pay attention to the values here on this one. All 125 through 250 volt receptacles, single phase 50 amps or less, and 3-phase 100 amps or less require GFCI protection. These voltages are for systems that are rated 150 volts or less to ground, and that translates to the 12240 single phase and the 120-208 3-phase voltages. In other words, it does not apply to 277-480 circuits. 210.8B. Let's take a look at 210.8B2. Same amp and voltage levels just discussed, but the definition was expanded to say kitchens or areas with food prep or cooking. So it's or instead of and that's the way it should have been all along. So what does that mean to you? Well, as an installer and as an electrical inspector, there is no question now that all Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, and ice cream shops like Ben & Callen's or Ben & Jerry's and meat delis all require this safety feature to protect the workers and the high schoolers and your nieces and nephews and kids that work in these areas. 210.8D is GFCI protection for specific equipment and appliances that are now listed in that section 422.5A. This list includes car vacuum machines, drinking water coolers, spray washers, tire inflation machines, vending machines, some pumps, dishwashers. All right. Section 422.5B has information on the types of GFCI protection and their location, where you have to put them in the circuit. Remember that the GFCI device location must be readily accessible to facilitate the monthly testing required by the manufacturer. Readily accessible means we should be able to walk right up to this location to get to this GFCI device. So 422.5A is the list of items. 422.5B is the methods and the location for the GFCI protection. Let's take a look at the very next section, which is 210.8E, which is a new section that requires GFCI protection for receptacles required by section 210.63. Well, 210.63 is the section that includes the receptacles required for HVAC equipment locations and the building indoor electric service location. So those receptacles were added. The last section of 210.8 is 210.8F as in Francis. And this section is a huge expansion of the GFCI rules. GFCI protection is now required on dwelling unit outdoor outlets supplied by single-phase branch circuit rated 150 volts or less to ground and 50 amps or less. So this means the 240 volt HVAC split unit outlets will have to be GFCI protected once the 2020 NEC is enforced in your state, your area. Be aware that clarification is needed between the requirements of 210.8F and 625.54, because 625.54 covers electric vehicle chargers, and it says only receptacles. And this would exclude the direct wired car charging stations. So there is a definite conflict there that's going to have to be addressed, and I will be sending in a note for a change in the 2023 NEC. Moving on to arc fault circuit interruption. In the last code cycle, 2017, the AFCI requirement was expanded to include guest rooms and guest suites of hotels and motels. Now, in the 2020 NEC section 210.12C, the AFCI areas now includes patient sleeping rooms that are in nursing homes and limited care facilities. And in section 210.12D, there is a revision that requires AFCI protection being installed where any circuits in the hotels and motels are extended or modified. You see, the original rule in the 2017 only included new hotels and motels that were being constructed. It did not address what happens if you modify or work or change on existing circuits in hotels and motels. So if you do touch an existing circuit, hotel or motel, modify it, change it in any way, then you will have to provide AFCI protection. And eventually we'll have all these circuits protected, which is our goal. Getting into the dwelling unit kitchen, there are big changes to receptacle requirements for kitchen peninsulas and islands. In previous code cycles, for example, let's say you have a 4-foot by 7-foot kitchen island, and it only required one receptacle. Now it's required that one receptacle outlet be installed per the first 9 square feet, and then another outlet per every additional 18 square feet or fraction thereof. So once the 2020 is adopted in your territory, that same 4-foot by 7-foot island requires a minimum of 3 receptacle outlets. So be sure to review section 210.52C and get used to using that formula that's there. The next change is from section 230.67, and it's a new requirement for surge protection on all dwelling unit electric services. So this surge protection must be built into the service panel or located immediately adjacent to the service equipment. What does immediately adjacent mean? Who knows? You know what it means, and I know what it means, but there's no definition in the code book, but you know what they're after. They want it right next to the service panel. So that means that this surge protection device must be a type 1 or a type 2 SPD. When you review that 230.67, please note this rule also applies to any electric service that is being replaced or upgraded at any dwelling units. You're changing a fuse panel to a breaker panel, or you're changing a 100 amp service up to a 200 amp service, or a 200 up to a 400. Okay, you will be required to install and provide that surge protection. You know, on an unprotected home, when that lightning strike surge comes barreling into the house, if it's not checked, it's going to travel through this whole house and all the circuits and destroy any of those fragile motherboards like the kind you find in a dishwasher or the microwave oven or the garage door opener or any of your 4 flat screen TVs. Those electronic circuits cannot handle that surge. Now, the good thing about having the surge protection devices in there is that they provide insurance. Now, they may only provide insurance to cover the material that was damaged, okay? They may not cover the labor. You got to check with the equipment that you buy, the surge protector that you buy. But what I'm saying is, don't be afraid to charge for these surge protective devices, because you're providing protection that's going to save equipment damage that might be in 5 figures or high 5 figures. Okay, so you're providing a valuable service with these surge protectors. This is something that should have been required a long time ago, but at least we're starting now. 230.67. Another important and game-changing requirement in the NEC is found in 230.85. This section requires an exterior emergency disconnect for dwelling units and provides important safety by placing an exterior emergency service disconnect for use by the first responders, like the firemen. It puts it outside where they can get to it safely. Presently, in the 2020 NEC, there are 3 options for placing this disconnect. The important thing to remember is this. The grounding electrode conductors that go to the ground rod and the other one that goes to the metallic water pipe must start in the main disconnect. You can't do your grounding from a sub panel. So this main disconnect now can be indoors and or outdoors, and it also can be the main panel breaker or a separate disconnect enclosure. So no matter where that main disconnect is located, you have to have an outdoor disconnect. Just remember this. Look, the grounding to the ground rod and metallic water pipe start in the main disconnect, wherever that is. Must come out of the main disconnect. Pay attention to 300.7a. To keep the installation free of condensation and problems that it causes, you have to seal up any air passages that allow warm air and hot air to meet with cold air or cool air. The resulting condensation and dripping or flow of water can rust out the interior of a circuit breaker panel or other enclosures. Most of us have already seen that. If you have ever been inside a walk-in cooler or a walk-in refrigerator and you see a jelly jar light that's half filled or all the way filled up with water, you now know what the problem is. The air passage was never sealed. So to prevent this condensation action, you must seal up the entry points, the penetration into these enclosures or a building. You got to seal them up on the outside of the conduit as well as inside the conduit. All right, silicone is a better choice than duct seal for this action. I used to tell the guys to use duct seal. And an HVAC guy said, duct seal doesn't do it. As soon as you stuff the switch back in the box, you've created another passageway and it fills up with water in no time, he said. So I said, what do you want me to tell everybody? He said, tell them to use silicone. Use the silicone on the outside of the conduit and on the inside. 300.7a. Section 314.16b5 has an interesting change. Up until now, in a 3-gang light box, for example, with 6 NM 12-gauge cables, you would count the 6 equipment grounding conductors as a single volume allowance of 2.25 cubic inches. Once the 2020 is in effect, this count will be 2.25 cubic inches plus 1.125 cubic inches for a total of 3.375 cubic inches now required for that grounding equipment grounding conductor. One thing I want to point out is that when you were doing your box fill calculations and you refer to table 314.16a, read the title of that table. That table is for metal boxes. The cubic inches and allowable conductor fill is conveniently stamped right inside any of these plastic boxes. Like this Carlon box, for example, this is an 18-inch, 18 cubic inch switch box. And it tells you right inside, it's imprinted inside, that this can handle 9 14s or 8 12 gauge or 7 10 gauge conductors. All right, so the way you could get in trouble is this. Normally these boxes are the ones that everybody will use, these 18 cubic inches, all right? Now you run into that customer that says, oh man, I want you to wire up my whole house with 12 gauge wire because I hear it's better. What? What does that mean, better? All right, so then your apprentice or the unknowing electrical contractor goes ahead and uses his everyday 18 cubic inch plastic boxes, and then finds out that every box he puts in is a violation where he goes into this box with 12 gauge, out of this box with 12 gauge, and tries to put a device in there because he's won over on the volume count. So be very careful on that. You run into that customer that says, oh man, give me 12 gauge because it's better. Well, you better plan on getting the larger boxes to keep yourself out of trouble. Let's now revisit 314.27c. Generally, the NEC does not try to predict the future, but in this case, with such a great possibility of injury, it does. In previous code editions, it was required that every ceiling box that could possibly entertain the installation of a ceiling fan would have to be listed as a sole support for ceiling fan type box if there were spare conductors installed for future edition of the fan. Well, they don't need those spare conductors for the future installation of a fan. So this revised rule requires this ceiling fan support box be installed whether or not there are any extra conductors installed for the future. So what does all this mean? Bottom line is that in all habitable rooms, like living rooms, family rooms, dining rooms, and all the bedrooms, if a ceiling box can be used in the future to hold a ceiling fan, it shall be a listed fan support box when first installed. Too many times people are going into existing homes, brand new homes. They say, oh man, I'd like to put a ceiling fan up in my dining room, ceiling fan with a light kit. And then you look up above the ceiling and all there's a plastic box that is not listed for holding fans. And they install it anyway, and then sooner or later that fan's going to fall. And that's when people get hurt, injuries, fires can start, etc. So it's very important. So use your head here. If the ceiling box is located like 10 inches away from the side wall, well, there's no way a ceiling fan could be installed there. So you don't have to put a fan supported type box, a fan supporting type box in that location. Section 334.30 has been revised. We are specifically talking about non-metallic sheathed cable here, okay, what you would normally call Romex. And the practice by some electricians to leave a long length of cable coiled up outside the box is causing problems. And why are they doing that? Well, you know, in case any wire needs to be pulled into the box in the future. I could count on one hand the number of times I had to do that over the past 50 years. There's other ways to extend the wire. You could just crimp onto what's left in the box. Don't worry about it. So without getting into the exception here, generally the first staple holding the cable cannot be more than 12 inches from the plastic box. And now the code is putting a limit on the length of cable allowed between that staple and the entry into the box of 18 inches. And what was happening was, I'll give you an example. I was called to do an inspection one time where the electricians had their last staple or their first staple from the box, whichever way you want to look at it, was 12 inches from the box, but then they proceeded to pass out the box by 3 feet and then return to the box with another 3 feet and then enter into the box itself. So that meant, yes, 6 feet of extra cable at every box, no matter how many cables went into that box throughout this whole house that was being rough wired. So code is putting a stop to that. After that last staple, you got 18 inches max before you get into the box. 406.9C has been revised. You know, first of all, you can't install a receptacle in the footprint of a tub or a shower in the bathroom. You could, however, be just 1 inch outside of that footprint and legally install a receptacle there. Now, with the 2020 NEC, the prohibitive zone is 3 feet out horizontally from the edge of the tub and 8 feet above the top of the bathtub or the shower stall. 3 feet out and 8 feet above. No receptacles in that territory. There is one exception if you're in a phone booth-sized bathroom, but generally you won't run into that situation. Get into section 406.12 and read the whole section. There's very important expansion in areas that are requiring the tamper-resistant receptacles to be installed. Not tamper-proof, nothing's tamper-proof. I can get a bunch of 5-year-olds to show you that. But tamper-resistant receptacles, where they have to be installed, those areas have been expanded. 406.12, read it. There's also important addition of locations and equipment requiring the GFCI protection. In section 422.5, there are some slight revisions of wording, and there's equipment being added to the list requiring GFCI protection. Bottle fill stations, sump pumps, and dishwashers were added to this 422.5 section after being pulled from other sections of the NEC. So now they're in one location. So notice that the big change here is that sump pumps and dishwashers, no matter if they're located in a dwelling unit or a commercial building, like colleges or cafeterias and restaurants, they all need GFCI protection. And note that it doesn't matter if the sump pump or dishwasher is direct wired or cord and plug connected. They all need GFCI protection if they're on 12240 volt or 12208. Please note that it does not matter if that sump pump or dishwasher is direct wired or cord and plug connected. They all need GFCI protection if they're on 12240 volt or 12208 volt, single phase or 3-phase. Next change, any of you who install these residential backyard Kohler or Generac generators, there is a new section 445.18D as in Delta, 445.18D as in Delta. That section requires an exterior emergency shutdown device for generators installed at 1 and 2 family dwelling units. This idea falls in line with the earlier change I mentioned about having to provide an exterior disconnect for the electric service for a dwelling unit. That was in 230.85. When the firemen knock off the electric to the house and the generator automatically starts up, the firemen have to be able to shut that generator off as well. So there's different ways to do this emergency shutdown, and some of the generator manufacturers have an exterior shutdown switch built into the unit already. If there isn't one, you're going to have to provide one. Okay, so there you have it. There's some of the highlights of the 2020 NEC changes. Feel free to send in your comments and questions. And thanks for watching this presentation and making yourself a better electrical professional. Van Wert, out.